Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's edition of Mourning in the Morning, presented by the Friends of Mount Hope and the Rochester Public Library. Today's presentation is entitled East Avenue in its Gilded Age, looking at the beautiful estates that were established along East Avenue, the road to Pittsford, in the late 19th and early 20th century. Today's presenter is Sally Millick, a past trustee and longtime cemetery tour author and guide with the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. She's active with other historical pursuits and presentations, and currently a board member of the Friends and Foundation of Rochester Public Library. Sally has contributed to several books on the history of upstate New York and Mount Hope Cemetery, and has photographed many Victorian-era cemeteries in her travels, most recently the Colon Cemetery in Havana, Cuba. Without further ado, Sally Millick.
Thanks very much, Brendan, and good morning, everyone. I think I probably have a lot of friends out in the audience, and I was just telling Brendan before the presentation, this is actually the first event I've done since, well, the last event that I did live was actually the Mourning in the Morning series in March at the library, so hopefully some of you are familiar with my work. So we wanted to talk about Rochester's Gilded Age today and how East Avenue was really a jewel in the city of Rochester, as is Mount Hope Cemetery. Mount Hope Cemetery opened in 1838, one of the first in the nation in the Victorian rural cemetery style. We have many formerly prominent citizens that are permanent residents at the cemetery, and as many of you are familiar, many of them have beautiful monuments and family plots. But it also was not a segregated cemetery, and there's a lot of other common plots and organizational, institutional groups that had plots at Mount Hope Cemetery. So it wasn't just for the posh and famous. At the same time, East Avenue evolved to one of the grandest avenues in the nation in the late 19th to early 20th centuries. The boomtown that Rochester became after the Erie Canal opened in 1825 spurred a lot of business, a lot of entrepreneurship, and East Avenue, beginning as an Indian trail from the Genesee River out to points east, evolved from a path to a dirt road, to a plank road, then a stone road, and eventually pavement. So it's really followed the history and evolution of our Rochester area. And Rochester was gifted with a lot of innovative and creative entrepreneurs and business people whose contributions not only benefited our immediate area, but our state and nation and the world. So this sudden wealth resulted in the building of these magnificent country homes on East Avenue, and that's the first thing I'd invite you to keep in mind, that this was a rural area. Now a lot of people think of downtown and East Avenue as part of downtown, but actually Northfield, which encompassed Brighton, Pittsford, Parenton, and a lot of the eastern suburbs, Northfield came right up to Goodman Street at this point in the 19th century. And this, again, most of the wealthy and successful people were living in the Third Ward, what we know now as Cornhill, and then eventually began building these country homes and mansions with sprawling land and gardens, as we'll explore today. So our journey begins with this longtime Indian trail that went from the Genesee River downtown out toward Northfield, and we'll start today with our Mount Hope resident, Oliver Culver. Now, Oliver Culver was one of these individuals that just seemed to have his hand in everything, a very high-energy guy. Actually, the first time he came to Rochester, he walked. He walked as an 18-year-old young man. He was waiting for a boat to take him to Schenectady, from Schenectady to Cleveland for a job. The boat was delayed, and so he and his buddy figured they would just start hiking. So they hiked west and wandered into the Irondequoit Bay, and apparently something stuck about that area with him because several years later he came back and ended up finding various means of employment and entrepreneurship. He built a mill. He was boarding at the Oring Stone Tavern, which is now on East Avenue, just inside of Brighton, the oldest building in our area. But as you see here, he had a variety of professions. He was a flour miller, he was a tradesman, he was a boat builder. He built large boats that would navigate around the Great Lakes and around Coit Bay. He was a land speculator and developer, as we'll find. He did build a tavern of his own and lived in that house/tavern. He got contracts to develop the locks toward Buffalo of the Erie Canal. And also, as these various suburbs and towns formed, at the first Brighton Town meeting, he was elected the first Brighton Town supervisor, and I am always amused that at the same time he was also named the Brighton Town coroner. He also was a New York State Assemblyman for a spell, and he was instrumental in the formation of Monroe County in the early 1820s. As you see here, this is his plot at Mount Hope, and here's Oliver, and here's his wife, Alice Ray. Other things that he was involved in is the formation of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which is still standing on Fitzhugh Street, along with Nathaniel Rochester and Silas Smith. This is the oldest public use building in the Rochester area right now. He's also known for a lot of his antics, and in his fur trade, he and one of his colleagues actually got into a knife fight. Well, they had a knife, the bear didn't, but took down a 400-pound bear, and again, just spent a lot of time navigating the lakes and figuring out different ways to develop the Rochester area. So Oliver and Alice's house/tavern was built near Culver Road and Oliver Street, and Mr. Culver is, I believe, the only person who has two streets named after him in Rochester, that being Culver Road and Oliver Street. And the house was built near that. Oliver is actually parallel to Culver, but in that area his house was built. And here you see a picture of the home that was actually moved to East Boulevard in the early 1900s. So the house still stands. You can see here on the right this side door, which was actually the door to the tavern. At this point, he had purchased 105 acres in this Northfield area, keeping in mind Northfield came up to Goodman. And at the time, it was the first house in the area, and then, of course, as other houses were built, it retained the honor of being the oldest house in the area. And the Culver family lived in it for about 129 years. So Oliver had been given the commission with some of his colleagues to, quote, cut a road 2 rods wide to the river. So this was the widening of this Indian trail. First, it was referred to by several different names, I guess, depending on which way you were going on the path. It could be the River Road if you were headed for the river, and if you were at the river heading east, it might be the road to Northfield or the road to Pittsford. So again, this house still stands. It did have some land behind it, but I know in the last few years there have been other houses built behind it, but this is still facing East Boulevard. The next Mount Hope resident in our story is Josiah Bissell, and he was a little, probably a generation younger than Oliver Culver. He was the engineer who built the second Erie Canal aqueduct, and that is still our current, supports our current Broad Street in downtown Rochester. And the first aqueduct was made of Medina sandstone, which I'll ask you to just hold that thought for a moment. Looking at this woodcut, or this print here, this is a print of the first aqueduct bridge of the Erie Canal across the Genesee River in Rochester. And first of all, it's a charming print. Second of all, I wanted to point out that this woodcut was printed by Everard Peck, who is another Mount Hope resident. We won't be visiting him today, but about 1827. And Everard Peck lived more in the Cornhill area, printer, historian, and I believe the Female Charitable Society, which was a very active group in the 19th century to help less or more underprivileged people, was formed by one of his wives at the Everard Peck home. Here is the Bissell plot, however, at Mount Hope Cemetery, and you see this stone monument. There was a movement in the late 1900s, early 20th century of a more naturalist monument. So sometimes in the midst of all these grand carvings and allegorical statues, you'll find these, basically a stone with a family name on it, or just a stone atop a monument. So just the same way as home and fashion styles evolve, so do funerary practices. Much like today, you don't see people getting many monuments. You see more of an orientation toward cremation and scattering grounds. So Josiah Bissell actually was the son of one of the, what we would call a pioneer of Rochester. It's a bit confusing, but his father's name was actually Josiah Bissell Jr., which can lead to some confusion. But Josiah was, again, an engineer. He was involved in several other bridge projects locally, including one that didn't work out so well in the 1850s when the bridge gave way and fell into the river. And later on in the Civil War, he organized an engineering regiment in the St. Louis area and somehow emerged from that known as Colonel Bissell. And that exact path, it's been hard to follow. But here is now, well, previous to being a colonel, here is Bissell's cottage that was designed by the architect A.J. Warner, who is also buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. In the 1850s, Bissell had purchased this East Avenue property to cultivate a nursery, which is another common theme we'll see among the fact that East Avenue was a country area and there was a lot of the original homeowners had nurseries, farms, and just basically more land. But what's interesting, too, is that this home, built in 1853, is made of Medina sandstone. And that sandstone came from the original canal aqueduct that he took down as he replaced it with the second aqueduct in the 1850s. Now, Bissell was also a very passionate East Avenue resident. He just loved the ambiance and had a great vision for this avenue leading into the main city area. As such, he did a lot for the beautification of the area. He planted horse chestnut trees from his home to downtown, and he's the one credited with calling it East Avenue. And I think he'd actually proposed that the street formerly be named East Avenue, took that idea to the city powers that be, and either that was delayed or refused. But not taking no for an answer, Bissell went ahead and hung signs designating this as East Avenue on some of these trees up and down the avenue. And so after a while, the name stuck, and again, we still refer to it as East Avenue today. And then to give you an idea, again, of the type of land and properties we're talking about, the land from this cottage, which you might also recognize because it's right across from the Rochester Museum and Science Center now. It's kind of tucked back behind some trees, but it's a charming cottage, and it had enough property that eventually, when it was sold to Charles Upton, a financier and banker, he laid out Upton Park, which is an entire residential street behind it, and sold off those properties as individual home plots. Bissell only lived in the home for a few years and then gave it or sold it to his brother, Charles. This is an interior picture I was able to find. I hadn't seen the inside before, but an interior picture I was able to find when Charles owned the home. And then it also passed through another owner before it went to Charles Upton, who subdivided behind the house. So I mentioned that there was a lot of horticulturists and farms on the East Avenue, on East Avenue, and one of them also was James Vick. Now, James Vick was from England. He actually was lifelong friends with Charles Dickens. He came over with his family as a child and then got into the printing business. And so he was a writer and an editor of one of the first kind of farm almanac circular type of publications called the Genesee Farmer. He got very involved in that, and then he formed a higher-end publication called the Horticulturalist. And this is where I think he started getting into a lot more of his sophisticated printing, and from there got into not only the horticulture aspect, but putting out these beautiful catalogs that in some estimates had circulation of over 250,000 people receiving these catalogs, and so therefore was selling plants and then eventually selling seeds. So again, just looking at some of the beautiful work, and you can look these up online as well, that were in his catalogs. He also was involved in the initial printing of Frederick Douglass's The North Star newspaper. And here we see part of his plot at Mount Hope. Here I showed you kind of a close-up, because where we see a lot of obelisks on the monuments at Mount Hope, this one's unique in that it has this flower on it, and then some other more classical or Victorian motifs. So as I mentioned, he went from having his nurseries into seed sales. So here we see several of his seed warehouses. There was one on State Street, and this one here in the lower part of the slide was on East Avenue near Westminster Road, so kind of where the St. Paul's Episcopal Church is now. This is Vick's home, which was on the corner of East Avenue and Vick Park A. So, not surprisingly, Vick Park A and B were named after James Vick. And when Vick bought the home that had been built in 1855 from Joseph Hall, Hall had actually owned the Union Hill racetrack. And the racetrack, actually, the long ends of it were Vick Park A and B. And then the short ends were East Avenue and Park Avenue. And this is why at the end of Park Avenue, at the end of this block on Park Avenue kind of arcs or turns, which was the accommodation of that racetrack. I think when they were finalizing East Avenue, they kind of made East Avenue a little more square, but you can still see the remains of the curve of that racetrack on Park Avenue. And this is the complete monument at Mount Hope, where we see it is an obelisk, very stylized at the top, and also very large. So keeping among our theme of showing, this presentation is really an evolution of a tour that I had given at Mount Hope Cemetery several times over the years. And the thing about planning presentations and tours at the cemetery is that you're somewhat limited by where people are buried, because you're leading people around a certain path, and so you're presenting their stories in the order that you can walk by them rather than in the order of their historical or chronological significance. So one of the things that was fun about putting this together is that we could follow more of a chronological arc, which we've already started. We started with Culver cutting the road, and then some of the horticulturalists and farms, and then another great example of that is Silas Smith. Now, Silas Smith was probably a generation older than the people that we've been talking about so far, and I was able to find some pictures of Silas and Mrs. Silas, who was Seba Hand Ward, and their beautiful plot at Mount Hope. And this is a picture that I just took last week. It really stands out not only with the white marble For some reason, this plot always seems to stay clean. You know, marble often gets a lot of discoloration and lichen and different things affecting it. But this is a great example of a Victorian family plot as well. So we have the family monument in the center. This is a Celtic cross style, and I believe this was designed by Claude Bragdon, the local designer and architect. Certainly, Bragdon did design a lot of Celtic cross type of monuments at Mount Hope, as well as some other more creative ones. But you have the plot here, and then you have the individuals buried around the plot. And the other thing that you can often see at these types of family plots is the difference of era, the different styles. So sometimes you'll see some stones that were obviously of one era, and then maybe Gothic came into style, and so you'll see more of a Gothic style. And that's another thing that you just notice when you hang around cemeteries a lot. Silas Smith had a provisions and grocery, mainly a general store, it sounds like, on the Lake Avenue area near where the former Kodak labs were, and as well as Four Corners and what was known as the Smith Arcade and Block. And we'll see some examples of that in a bit. But what Silas did on East Avenue is he built Woodside. Now, Woodside was the second mansion on East Avenue with 95 acres around it. Now, many of you probably are familiar with this house. It is on the corner of Sibley Place between Alexander and Goodman on East Avenue, obviously. It was built in 1839 as, again, a country house, and it was considered far from the center of town, which is funny since it's really rather close by today's standards. And we'll be telling some other stories about this later, where the Hiram Sibley family actually owned the house for a spell, and again, details later. But here we just have a really beautiful shot of the house all lit up at night. This beautiful architecture, but also this cupola on the top. And after the house was used as a residence, eventually it ended up as the headquarters of the Rochester Historical Society, which is the postcard you see here. And then it passed from the Historical Society back into private hands just in the last 20 years. And here are some interior shots. So I mentioned the cupola, and again, we often take for granted our electricity and our modern lighting, but the cupola, I think of this as just providing abundant natural light during the day. And this picture I had taken from a coverage of a historic house tour where the house was open a few years ago. But you see, you can come into the stairway, and if you were standing looking up this beautiful curve and banister, excuse me, as you see here, that goes up several stories and lets the light in from that fabulous cupola. And I was also able to find a picture of the home more in the 19th century. Looking here, these look like electrical bulbs, so I don't know if this is when the Smiths lived there, but it is a more period picture that I thought was kind of interesting to include. So again, we're looking at a transition from this rural farm area to these more elegant estates, and a great example is the 474 East Avenue property that many of us, again, are familiar with, if not from going up and down East Avenue, but those of us who had Boy Scouts in a particular age, the property eventually became the head of the home of the Boy Scout Council for a number of years. But it was built by William Pitkin, and William Pitkin built the house again around 1839. And here is the Pitkin plot on, at Mount Hope Cemetery. And we see here this American flag on one of the grave sites around the family monument. And that's not for William, that's actually for his second wife, Louise, who was a daughter of the American Revolution, because she was Nathaniel Rochester's daughter. So Pitkin has his plot and the family, again, buried around it. He had built this beautiful home with a number of acres behind it, again, that were known as the Pitkin Woods. And so he moved his family into it, and it wasn't long that Louise really wanted to get back to the Third Ward, get back to Cornhill where her friends and family were, again, recognizing how this was a more rural area. This is just a lovely photo, I think, showing the original bones of the house. You have this great picture of the man with the horse and the wagon, again, showing the mid-19th century picture of East Avenue evolving. I'm sure this road was still dirt. So William Pitkin sold the house to Azariah Boody, which I just think is one of the best names of the residents of the cemetery. And Azariah Boody was born in Quebec. He arrived in Rochester around 1850 as a very successful railroad industry executive. So he had been involved in, as a board member, as an executive for a number of railroads. He consolidated a number of railroads into the New York Central Railroad. He also was a trustee of the University of Rochester from 1853 to 1865. And it's kind of hard to find out all the details. You know, we're all detectives going back, looking at history. But around 1853, he donated the Pitkin Woods, all that land behind his house, to the University of Rochester. And when I was putting this together, I thought, well, gee, if he became a trustee of the University of Rochester in 1853, I'm not really sure if that evolved because he just gave them all this land or because, you know, he was sincerely involved in the university. But when you think of that house and all the land behind it going back to what we know as University Avenue, that's why it's University Avenue, because the University of Rochester had been founded in the 1850s, and once Boody donated the land, by 1861, the university had moved into that whole area there with University Avenue, the art gallery, where you might see some of the old dorms and so forth on University. His plot at Mount Hope is a pretty classic Victorian family plot with the base and this figure on the top who's leaning on an anchor. Now you see many of these figures leaning on anchors, beautiful women's statuary, and that is not a nautical reference. It's more of a reference to the biblical phrase, "My faith is my anchor." And so it's a symbol of faith. And often, again, like you see here, the statue will have her hand on her heart or potentially have her hand raised toward the heavens, and that, again, depicts faith. Many of you who have been on Mount Hope tours or cemetery tours before know that the Victorians elaborately decorated their plots and right down to any type of foliage that's depicted on the plot normally has a meaning, such as ivy being undying love or an oak leaf steadfastness. So these women statuary, it's the same thing, that they may depict hope or faith. Another fact is that the adjacent street next to Boody's property was named after his horse, Prince, and Prince Street still, of course, exists today. Now, in 1852, Boody was elected to Congress, but he only served 7 months, and he pled out saying that he needed to resign due to other obligations. And again, it's unclear what those other obligations were, since he did remain in Rochester for at least several more years. So our next owner of 474 is Daniel Powers. And Daniel Powers, again, has a beautiful monument. You can see the similar type of design where we have a classical base. We have some mourning cloth or fabric here carved, and then some stylization at the top. Daniel Powers was a banker. He was very wealthy. He was an art collector, and we'll hear more about some of his adventures as a builder in a moment. But in 1855, he purchased the home from Boody, and he added another floor and a mansard roof. So again, first, and now we have 3 floors. Now, mansard roofs, or mansard roofs, were a product of France, where Monsieur Mansard had figured out that at that point you were taxed by how many floors your home had. And so Monsieur Mansard figured out that you could actually add another story to a home, but make it look like a roof. So you weren't going to be taxed on 3 stories, you'd be taxed on 2. I don't know what the taxation structure was here in Rochester, but Powers did add this floor with this beautiful cresting on the top, and just added a whole different level of elegance to the home. So we'll talk more about Mr. Powers in a moment, but following the evolution of the house, by the 40s and 50s, sadly the house was abandoned, then it was leased as a rooming house. So you see here where it's really kind of not seeing its best face. By this time the mansard roof had been removed or remodeled. We still have 3 floors, but it's really looking a little down in the mouth. And then once the Boy Scouts took over, the Boy Scouts of America headquarters, it did get uplifted, and you see this here when it was the Boy Scouts of America. We also can see here down by the steps Daniel Powers' initials, and those are still there. There used to be some nice iron or some other type of stone, I think lions on this. Haven't been able to find any pictures of those, but we do still see his initials on the building. And now they've been, it's no more Boy Scouts, it has been renovated as luxury apartments, and still a very active building. So back to Powers. Powers, I think it might have been his father-in-law, had owned the Eagle Hotel. And the Eagle Hotel stood, as you see here, on the northwest corner of Buffalo Street, which is West Main, and State Street. And this hotel stood there for a number of years, and then there was a fire, and it burned. And so Daniel Powers took it upon himself to rebuild. So you see a very similar corner structure here, but this is the original Eagle Hotel, and then this is what Daniel Powers started building into what we know now as the wedding cake building, or the Powers building downtown. Now, the Powers building had a lot of interesting engineering assets. So it was built with a structural steel frame and a cast iron exterior that was made to look like stone, again with the idea of it being fireproof. It's also the first building in the United States with a hydraulic elevator, obviously a number of floors, and his art gallery was on the top floor or floors, and so of course you wanted people to be able to get up there to see them. He built his building as fireproof, and then you see as he added the story on the East Avenue home, he also started adding stories to his Powers building. So here we start with the original 5 and this tower, and then over in the postcard you see the 5, and we have 2 more towers plus a flag tower. And again, we'll touch more on that in a moment. But he was steadfast that this was a fireproof building, and then unfortunately then he realized that iron buildings can burn, but by then he had enough clout with the city, and by token of his position in the city, he demanded the city get new water systems, including a steam-powered system that would have better water pressure if a fire should occur and firefighters were dousing the fire. then we come to the Hiram Sibley family, and the Hiram Sibley family had several homes in the area between Alexander Street and Prince Street. As a matter of fact, part of one of his daughter's homes still stands on Prince Street as its own home. But this is a early print, I think it's probably from around 1877, showing the Sibley home, and we have some magnifications of this a few slides out, but this was the original home, which was an Italianate style, and then it was renovated, and again, we'll see that in a moment. And here's a picture of the back of that property, and then here's a picture of what it looked like from the side. So here's Hiram Sibley. He was the founder, a founder, with Ezra Cornell and Don Alonzo Watson and others, of Western Union and its first president. And that's what he's probably best known for. But he also was a seedsman. He had a lot of agricultural interests across the U.S. I'm sure that they grew plants and seeds on the property, but he also had a seed house in Chicago. He owned significant agricultural land in Illinois and other interests, again, across the U.S. He was known as Rochester's wealthiest man until the Eastman Dry Plate Company came along. And then in the middle of all this, I've inserted this little map, and you can see here in red the state of Alaska. And that is because as Hiram was pursuing his pushing Western Union across the Bering Straits and connecting with Russia, he became friends with the Tsar of Russia and found that Russia was in the situation where it was land rich but cash poor. And so the Tsar started talking to Mr. Sibley about that and about potentially selling some land. And Sibley brought that idea back to our Secretary of State, William Seward, who lived in Auburn. And that set in motion Alaska becoming part of the United States. So another accomplishment of Hiram Sibley. And here's just a quote that I found. There are two most valuable possessions which no search warrant can get at, which no execution can take away, and which no reverse of fortune can destroy. They are what a man puts in his head, knowledge, and into his hands, skill. And of course, I would say that that applies to women as well. So this is the Sibley plot at Mount Hope. It's often the first stop on tours that include the family, starting at the gatehouse, and again follows the Victorian family plot of having the monument in the middle and the deceased buried around it. So this is the view from the back of the monument. You can actually see Hiram and his wife here. And then you also see this S, this little stone, and these are cornerstones. So you have a square plot, you put a little marker on each corner, so you've designated your family plot, and if you're wealthy enough, you actually put your family initials, like an S, on the cornerstone, which I captured here. And then in one of the obituaries that I was able to find, a quote, he amassed wealth but was most generous and helpful in his use of it. His association with one of the most important inventions in the world, in the telegraph, would of itself class him among the foremost men of the 19th century, but his nature was so broad, his resources so great, and his mentality so strong that his efforts in that line were just an initial step in a very active and useful career whereby the world has been enriched materially, mentally, and morally. So after living in the home that we were just looking at, he also had another home designed by an architect named James Gould Cutler, who again will come up several times today, and was an East Avenue and a Mount Hope resident. And this home was more toward East Avenue and Alexander Street. And you can see a lot of this. So when we talk about East and Alexander, we're talking about where they're building the new Marriott, formerly the City Grill, formerly the Treadway Inn, that area there, and you can still see the fencing that surrounded some of the Sibley properties. One of his Sibley's daughter, Emily Sibley Watson, also is buried at Mount Hope. She has a plot kind of adjacent to the Hiram Sibley plot. Her stone lies flat. This was intentionally flat, and designed by Claude Bragdon, again, the local designer and architect. And one of the things I find fascinating about this is that thinking of our climate and thinking how the earth breathes, and if you have a slab of stone lying on the earth in our area, sooner or later it may crack because of the expansion and contraction of snow and ice. And I love how he's built in these little drains here. So as the snow and ice melt off of the monument, that just trails right off into the grass, therefore preserving the detail of the stone. So Emily Sibley Watson was a well-known philanthropist in the area. This is a young picture of her. She had a son, James Averill, from her first marriage, and James sadly passed away at the age of 26 of typhoid. And he was, I believe, an architect, had a lot of artistic interests, and in his memory, she founded the Memorial Art Gallery, and this is the original art gallery building, which is part of the building today. So when we refer to the Memorial Art Gallery, we really mean the James Averill Memorial Art Gallery. And when you go into this section of the art gallery today, you can see a statue that is dedicated to him by Emily Sibley Watson. Also, she was a sponsor of a young violinist. Here you see in the lower corner David Hochstein. And David Hochstein was a very promising violinist, and but then went off to enlisted for World War I, and sadly was killed in that conflict. And so in his memory, Emily founded the Hochstein Music School, which is still operating downtown. And an interesting part of the Hochstein is also that it was, one of its charters was to provide music education for children of all economic backgrounds. You have to think in the 19th century, if you were going to have music lessons, your parents had to own the instrument. You had to be able to afford to have a teacher come to your home and train you. Whereas the idea of a music school that people of different economic backgrounds could go to and develop skills and enrich themselves was a really beautiful way to memorialize David Hochstein. Other buildings that we have are contributions that came from the Sibley family. Just sticking with the senior Hiram, he donated the money for the Sibley Hall, which was a library and museum on the original University of Rochester site. Again, University, Prince Street, working back from East Avenue. And I love the little car here in the corner parked out front of the library. He also, I mentioned he founded the Western Union with Don Alonzo Watson and Ezra Cornell. Of course, Ezra Cornell founded Cornell University. And Sibley contributed the Sibley College of Mechanical Engineering and Mechanic Arts in 1870. And we see a picture of that here. And just going to Cornell's website now, it's amazing this has evolved into aeronautics and, you know, obviously keeping up with the times with engineering. But Mr. Sibley was the one who donated that original engineering college in 1870. And then in 1925, Hiram Watson Sibley, who was Hiram's son, he built the Hiram Sibley building in memory of his father. Now, all of us who live in Rochester have driven by this building many times as you head into downtown or up Alexander Street. But I would just invite you for a moment to really look at it. You know how it is, you're not looking at the detail of the architecture necessarily, Well, this building was modeled after Sir Christopher Wren's wing at Hampton Court, which was one of King Henry VIII's palaces in England. And the detail is just amazing. So I would invite the next time you're in this area on foot to really take in this building, because there's a lot of beautiful detail and architectural balance to it. And a number of open businesses, nightclubs and restaurants in the area right now. And just wrapping up on the Sibleys, this is a magnification of that original print that I showed you, because I actually found a picture that is pretty much the same thing. So we have a picture looking up toward the house. So now your back is to University Avenue and you're looking up toward East Avenue. Where this picture, same thing, you have the barn and you have over here on the right other structures. So that's kind of a cool before and after. And then here on the right, you have your original Italianate style home, and then after it was renovated to more of a federal style and what it looks like today. Sibley's grandson and his wife lived at 400 at this lower right-hand home for a number of years. Harper Sibley was a lawyer. He was a director of Western Union, president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the USO, and he and his wife did a lot of traveling all over the world in terms of supporting social services with their mission work. They actually were also quite civic and social leaders here in Rochester, hosting a National Association for the Advancement of Colored People meeting at their home in 1950s. Also, after Harper passed away, Georgiana continued to be quite politically active, and then in one act of, not rebellion, but she was invited to host President Nixon at her home in the 60s and turned down that invitation based on her differences of opinion with him politically. And in her older years, she actually invited children to come over for tea, regardless of their status or race. There was kind of an open house where the children could come in, look at the house, they could all talk. And I always think this is a great transition from the more formal social habits of the 19th century, something as formal as tea, moving into the 1960s where things started getting a little bit more casual. So this is Georgiana and Harper's plot at Mount Hope. There is a Sibley, again, this is a Celtic cross, but I think a tree fell on it a number of years ago, so actually the cross is lying on the ground behind it, between this base and these stones. But then over to the left, next to these stones, are three of Harper's siblings, all who passed away under the age of 10, I believe. And just want to make the point that even though these people were living in a lot of wealth and luxury and opportunity, that wealth did not necessarily prevent or protect your children due to dying of illness before modern medicine really came into play. So moving across the street now to the Erickson home. You may know this as the Genesee Valley Club now, and this was built by Aaron Erickson. It was the third mansion on East Avenue, and Aaron had a daughter, Caroline Erickson, who married Gilman Hill Perkins, who also lived in the neighborhood. So as far as the house's history, in 1919, when Caroline passed away, her grandson, Aaron Erickson, had inherited the house from her, and since he'd been involved with the Genesee Valley Club for a number of years, he sold or donated the property to them in 1922, and the Genesee Valley Club has added on to the building several times, put tennis courts in and so forth. That is still an active social and athletic club. But Aaron, the patriarch of all this, he was the largest wool commission and merchant in the United States. On his 50th birthday in 1856, Aaron Erickson could claim that he had, quote, owned more American wool than any man living or dead, and that he had quote, disbursed in the wool trade over $20 million, unquote, and that he, quote, was the first man to export wool from this country to England. So I did not verify all those, but that was what he was saying at his 50th birthday party. He had begun as a blacksmith and then worked his way into the wool trade, and then after he was successful in the wool trade, he founded the Union Bank, which grew into a very exclusive and profitable banking house. So the wealth of this family was substantial, and the family traveled extensively in Europe, even to India, and then after Aaron died, his daughter and son-in-law, his son-in-law bought the house, and so then Caroline found herself living back in the house where she had actually grown up. So their family plot here at Mount Hope is also equally magnificent. The highlight of this is the Weary Pilgrim sculpture, which was created by the world-renowned sculptor Nicola Cantalamessa Popoti, and recently cleaned by the Friends of Mount Hope. This definitely, sometimes this particular monument has a lot of ravages from weather and tree sap falling on it, and the fact that it's marble, but these days he's looking nice and clean and shiny. Again, to give you an idea of their wealth, when Caroline and Gilman's son was going to marry Antoinette Pomely of Oswego, the couple's preference was to be married in an English church, so they literally all went to England for the wedding, and they were married in their English church. Caroline Erickson was also one of the founders of the School for Deaf Mutes, as one of their daughters was completely hearing impaired, and just well known as a local philanthropist. But here you see the Erickson-Perkins plot is at a high point at Mount Hope Cemetery in Section G, and when you're walking up the hill toward it, you can just see this magnificent statue sitting on the top of the hill. Within the plot, here we have Caroline and Gilman Hill Perkins stones as well. So sadly, the English church wedding, though I'm sure it was beautiful, the bride did not live long beyond it. Sadly, Antoinette Pomely died at the age of 31. Here we see her monument in the plot, and just looking at it sideways, you can see as if there was room for another name there. So I'm not sure if they had made the plot. This was a Claude Bragdon designed monument, and I'm not sure if the intent was to have her husband buried with her. Her husband, Erickson, we see here on the right, did remarry to Elizabeth Guinea Perkins, and so rather than being buried with Antoinette, he is right next door with his second wife. On East Avenue, you might be familiar with the mansion which is now housing the American Association of University Women. This house was originally a wedding gift for Erickson and his second bride from her parents in 1907. And again, just a beautiful brick structure there on East Avenue. But also I wanted to highlight the detail of this Bragdon-designed monument to Antoinette. So just diving deeper a little bit on Gilman Hill and Caroline Erickson Perkins, here's pictures of them, and I took this off of a history of the Rochester School for the Deaf so which is the RSD here, which I had said she was instrumental in founding. And here's Gilman as well. So Carolyn married Gilman, who lived across the street, and we have a couple of examples of this kind of intermarriage and house swapping, I'll call it. Gilman was a partner in a big grocery operation and then subsequently became trustee of several banks and very active in various charities. As I mentioned, after her father died, Gilman bought her father's house, and then Caroline ended up living back in the house where she grew up. Another example of this is that Daniel Powers, who we talked about, his daughter Jessie married the son of Caroline and Gilman. Then later, Daniel Powers' son John would marry Gilman and Caroline's youngest daughter Gertrude as well. So again, you have a lot of intermarriage and moving around between these houses. So here's just a little detour now that we've met Mr. Silas Smith and we've met the Sibleys and we've met the Perkins. So let's just follow this story. So in 1873, Hiram Sibley purchased Woodside that Silas had built to give to his son upon his marriage. But his son didn't want the house because he preferred to live in New York City. So a couple of years later, Hiram Sibley's daughter had passed away, and Sibley invited his son-in-law and his second wife to move into Woodside. In 1882, the second Mrs. Atkinson died, but Hobart, the son-in-law, continued to live there with Hiram's granddaughters. Both daughters' weddings took place at Woodside. And then when Elizabeth got married, she just moved next door to 6 Sibley Place, because Sibley Place is right around the corner from Woodside. And then in 1889, Hiram's granddaughter married Gilman Henry Hubble Perkins, Caroline and Gilman's son, and he moved from his parents' home, the Genesee Valley Club, up to Woodside. Sadly, he passed away after several years, and then Marie married again, and her second husband then moved into Woodside. So you can see how that not only was there a lot of intermarriage, but as I said, house swapping. And then Marie Atkinson Perkins Willard is the one who left Woodside to the Rochester Historical Society, where it remained until the last 10 or 20 years. So George Thompson, switching gears, George Thompson is someone that I have just discovered. He was a contractor and builder, and it's his home, the demolition of his home really drew attention to the fact that these beautiful homes were being lost. Now again, you can imagine these are huge houses. Now many of them are split into condos and apartments, and just alone the condos are 3,000 or 4,000 square feet. So extremely expensive to maintain as a single family home, and a lot of these had fallen into disrepair. So you see here, I was able to find a picture actually of the inside of the house. It must have been before demolition because it looks pretty bare. But this was his beautiful home, and this is how it looked before it was taken down. Just a classic haunted house, scary movie scenario. But this is what kicked off the movement toward making East Avenue a preservation district. And when I say George was a builder, he was a phenomenal builder. We often talk about the architects, A.J. Warner and James Gould Cutler, but Thompson was the builder. So he built much of the Exchange Street block, including the Smith Perkins and Company building, which this was Perkins' grocery operation, not related to Silas Smith. He also built the Kimball Tobacco Factory, which was where our current war memorial is. He built the Main Street Bridge. He was known for railroad bridge construction all over the nation, and many roads. He built the paved road between Lyons and Geneva, and many other roads. This is his plot at Mount Hope. Again, pretty classic obelisk style. But what I found interesting, again, being so prolific a builder, in his obituary in the Democrat and Chronicle in 1884, he died in 1827, so I think he wasn't even 60 years old. And they noted it as death by total prostration of the nervous system caused by overwork. A man of wonderful business and executive ability, coupled with his phenomenal energy and physical powers, made his business life, typo, a brilliant and unqualified success, a man who inspired the utmost respect and esteem among all with whom he became acquainted. And then we come to Henry Alva Strong. Henry Alva Strong was the first president and longtime president of Eastman Kodak Company. But here we see his mausoleum at Mount Hope, and just took a picture I could see through the window of the actual inside of the mausoleum. For those of you not familiar with mausoleums, they often have these drawer kind of structures in the side and toward the back of the mausoleum that house the actual remains. And I love this story that after the Civil War, he and his uncle began a buggy whip company, and we see here Strong and Woodbury, whips and lashes. And they became boarders of Maria Eastman. So George Eastman's mother was renting rooms, and she rented rooms to Henry and his uncle. And I have to believe this is how Henry Alva Strong met George Eastman. And George Eastman and him were just dear friends. Obviously, Eastman trusted him as the first president, and he held the presidency until he died in 1919. Strong would address letters to George Eastman as Dear Skinny, this kind of casual buddiness and friendship that they enjoyed. And then after Strong passed away, George Eastman contributed, I think, a third of the money to the University of Rochester to form the Strong Memorial Hospital, which is, again, the Strong Memorial in memorial of Colonel Henry Alva Strong. Now, Strong, again, was an extremely successful businessman. He had been involved, again, in the buggy whip company, but he also had been involved with the Rochester Button Company, the boating machine company that was founded and run here in Rochester, several banks, insurance companies, utilities, and obviously with the Kodak taking off, he became one of the wealthiest men in the United States. And this is part of his home that still remains, and my favorite part of it. It's this Jacobean, gorgeous house next to the planetarium, between the planetarium and Oxford Street. And he built this, and then there's also a whole addition that goes on over to Oxford Street, and now inhabited by offices. He also was an avid philanthropist. He financed several halls and auditoriums at several colleges. Here in the lower left-hand corner, we have the Strong Auditorium at University of Rochester. Then, hold on, leaf blower. Frank Elwood was a lawyer who did not make it to his 50th birthday, but his family owned a lot of property down in the Exchange and Main and Exchange Street, Four Corners area. He also had a house on East Avenue, so I do have a picture of that here. But I couldn't really find a lot of note of interesting things he did other than building this building, the Elwood Building, which was on the corner of Main and Exchange, where the Crossroads building is now. He built the building dedicated to the memory of his father, and again, this is just a beautiful postcard showing the Powers building here on the far left, and then the Elwood building with its clock, and also an element that Elwood had requested was that he had a centralized mail system in his building, and he consulted with his architect, James Gould Cutler, about that request. Which brings us to the mail chute king. So James Gould Cutler, again, was an architect. He, in 1883, took out a patent for the mail chute, And what I found interesting is that he ultimately had 30 patents for variations on this invention. Now, recently we were doing a pop-up historian event at Mount Hope, and I was stationed at Cutler, and especially people who were very used to mail chutes, it's like, what's the big deal? How could this be an incredible invention? But apparently it was worth 30 patents. So the Cutler Mail Chute Company was run out of Rochester for a number of years. We will see the Cutler mail chutes all over the U.S. and all over the world. Through his political connections, James Gould Cutler had his mail chute declared as the only mail chute that the U.S. postmaster would pick up mail from. Think, again, in those days, snail mail was really important, and postmasters were held accountable if people didn't get their mail, because it was literally the only way people had to communicate in different cities. As Brandon had mentioned in the beginning of the prezo, I had been in Cuba recently, and I was thrilled to see a Cutler mail chute from Rochester, New York, in a hotel in Havana. This is the Cutler Mausoleum. I always think for an architect, it's not one of the more glamorous ones, but I guess there's beauty in its simplicity. And this is James Gould Cutler's home on East Avenue. This was on the corner of Merriman Street. And here we actually have a picture of looking from Merriman Street with James right in front of the home. This is where the Rochester Joint Board is now. So this was the home he'd built for himself, and there's this bird or bat type of structure on the top, or gargoyle. It's hard to magnify, but it's a fascinating detail on the house. He was also our mayor from 1904 to 1907, and beyond his architecture, he's noted for being a really great mayor. He oversaw the upgrading of the public market. He oversaw the creation of the reservoir at Cobb's Hill. He donated money for the University of Rochester Cutler Union when the University of Rochester opened its participation to women. The women didn't have anywhere to congregate like a student union, so he donated the money for the Cutler Union, which is that cathedral-like structure right next to the art gallery today. And then if you go down Main Street today, heading toward downtown to the Liberty Pole, on the right you will see the Cutler building still stands here, and again, a great old photo of these old cars. Thomas Layton was another resident of East Avenue, and he owned the Layton Bridge and Iron Works Company, which built over 100 bridges around the U.S., several locally. He also had business as far away as Panama, and this was $1 million a year business employing 200 people, and it specialized in railroad and highway bridges made of, quote, American riveted lattice. He was also a director at the City Hospital and the president of the City Bank of Rochester, and his business was located on Layton Avenue, which is behind East High School. So for anyone who attended East High School and is familiar with Layton Avenue there off Culver, that is the same Layton. He also had created the first swing bridge in Rochester that crossed the Erie Canal near Broad Street. And here I have a postcard of the Vincent Street Bridge, which was where one of the bridges that was in Rochester, an ad for the company, and then a picture of the Layton plot. Now this monument is like 8 feet high. It's very large. And a couple interesting things about it. First of all, the person who carved the dates on it made a mistake with Kate Layton, his wife, and so it actually looks like she died several months before she was born. And on the back you can see there is a memorial to their children, because they had 5 children, and as any parent's nightmare, the household was struck by cholera, and 3 of their 5 children died within a few days of each other. So he had bought the Bates Ryder house, and I often think how funny this is because it's referred to as the Bates Ryder house, and this is further up East Avenue, more toward the East Avenue Wegmans area. But it was an Italianate style, and he bought it from Colonel Bates and eventually sold it to the Ryders. But Leighton, who lived in it for 30 years and probably is the more well-known of all the owners, is not even mentioned in the name of the house. But here's an older picture when Colonel Bates owned the home, again taken from probably from the 1877 history of Rochester book, and we see some people out here for a Sunday ride and the house set back from the dirt road. And then here's a more modern picture. Leighton had bought the house for about $4,000 in 1875, and when he added a wing, it became the largest house on East Avenue. Samuel Wilder is another East Avenue resident, and he lived near Oxford Street, and actually there's a portion of Oxford Street between Park and East Avenues that was once known as Wilder Place. So this is a picture of his home, and again, just a quote from one of the obituaries I found: "It is doubtful if any Rochesterian had so many friends. In all the relations of life, he was so courteous, cheerful, and generous, considerate of the rights and feelings of others, that he drew men towards him as with hooks of steel, and a friend once gained was never lost. He cared little for success in business, except that success gave him the opportunity to do something toward the comfort and happiness of others," which of course is a lovely thought. This is their family plot. And this circles back to Daniel Powers, because one of the things Samuel Wilder, amongst all his banking and business successes, one of the things he's known for is building the Wilder Building, which still stands at Main and Exchange. And this was the first skyscraper in Rochester. It actually had these turrets on the top that no longer are there. But it was 11 stories high. Local architect A.J. Warner, who's also buried at Mount Hope. And of course, it had a Cutler mail chute because the Elwood building across the street had one. And with the demolition of the Elwood building, the Cutler mail chute in the Wilder building is actually the oldest Cutler mail chute installed. In 1985, this became registered on the National Register of Historic Places. But how this plays into the Powers is that once Wilder built his 11-story building, now Powers, I think we last left off with him where he had 5 stories and a tower. Well, he then added another layer and that large flag tower so he could retain the title of having the tallest building in Rochester. Frederick Cook contributed in so many ways. He was a German immigrant, and when I say contributed in so many ways, he, as you see this quote here, "A penniless boy of 14 became one of the most successful businessmen of the Empire State, serving as the Secretary of State of New York, and he was actually offered to run for governor, which he probably would have won, but he declined. He had a lot of different business interests. Again, he'd been born in Germany. He was on his way to a nice, privileged life when his father died when he was around 14, and he was pretty much set to fend for himself. So he came to New York because he had a married sister in Buffalo. He ended up getting a job on the railroad as the conductor of a quote-unquote immigrant train. And what this meant is that there were cars dedicated to people who spoke another language, like the Germans. And he could speak German, and so he took a job as the conductor on that, and then as a result of that, met George Pullman, who was creating his Pullman Palace train car company. Frederick Cook put a lot of his savings invested into the Pullman company, and that ended up turning out a really good move for him It established his wealth, and you see here his home on the corner of Arnold Park. Again, architect A.J. Warner, and this is another view from Arnold Park of that home. Now it's a parking lot for the church, I believe. And this is his magnificent plot, again with the cupola, and you can't see it as clear here, but the iron under the Cook arch here actually says Frederick Cook, and there actually was a hole in the back of the mausoleum, and so I snuck my phone in there just to take a shot of what it looked like. And obviously had been vandalized, so now it's all locked up. But just, again, a unique picture of the mausoleum itself. He was the owner of Cook Opera House also, and Cook Opera House was an opera house, and it was where the convention center is now. Obviously, this picture was taken in, I think, the late 70s, just before it was taken down and the convention center went up. But here you see under the title, these were the faces. We used to climb up on the parking garage across the street from this to smoke cigarettes as a teenager, and we used to look over to this top and see the drama faces and just that beautiful top of the opera house that hosted a lot of celebrities in its day. Later, the theater became the Embassy, which was mainly known for its burlesque shows, and obviously this is the more downtrodden part of the opera house's life. And the other thing I'll say about Cook is his daughter was married at the East Avenue mansion, and the New York Times listing of that event the next day, it was noted that there was 150 of the intimate friends and relatives of the bride and groom. The marriage was performed by Bishop McQuaid in the main hall of the house. After the ceremony, the guests went to a reception at the Powers Art Gallery, which was attended by all the society people of the city, plus many from out of town. So again, you see all these people very intertwined with one another's lives. And not surprisingly, Frederica, his daughter, named her son Frederick Cook O'Connell. John Van Voorhis was another resident of East Avenue, and I've included him because my next-door neighbor is his great-great-grandson. And we've been talking a lot about this, but John was actually the attorney representing the election inspectors that allowed Susan B. Anthony and her compatriots to register to vote. He assisted in the defense of Susan B. Anthony with Henry Selden, her defense attorney, as well as the women who accompanied her, and he was a three-term congressman as well. And their plot is quite modest. Here's his stone, and I like on the back, his stone says, "Here sleeps the soul of loyalty." Again, a very nice way to be remembered. His, I think, sister-in-law also has a monument here in memory of Marie Elizabeth, the wife of Charles Van Voorhis, who fell asleep in Los Angeles on Christmas night, 1910. Another way to be remembered. And lastly, let's talk about Otis Day. General Elwell Otis did not live on East Avenue, but I'd invite you to just look at this picture for a moment. This is looking from our former Sibley's building. So this is East Avenue going up here to the right. But Elwell Otis was the commanding general and military governor over the U.S. forces in the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. You see his educational credentials here. He also accepted the surrender of the Sioux by Chief Sitting Bull. And when he came back to town, apparently it was a big deal because Claude Bragdon designed this kind of papier-mâché Arc de Triomphe, which stood here, and the whole parade walked through underneath this arch in his honor. And here we see a carving from his stone that says, "Not the last stroke, but every stroke brings victory." Like you have to keep chipping away. So when Otis died in 1909, this was his funeral on Fitzhugh Street. So we're now down by the Corpus Christi Brick Presbyterian Church. City Hall is up here in the upper, like the mid left. But just look at this picture. Not only were all the trains sold out because people were trying to get to Rochester to pay homage to this man that I hadn't even heard about until I gave tours at Mount Hope, but look at the detail and just this beautiful film, all the different blacks and grays and all these people, the carriages pulled up for the funeral. This is just one of my favorite photos in Rochester history. I could look at it for a long time. And this is his plot at Mount Hope. So he was buried at Mount Hope, and there was a bronze plaque here, but then he was disinterred and reinterred with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. So actually his monument, the Otis Monument at Mount Hope, is now what we call a cenotaph, which means there is a monument, but there's no remains there. Before I close, I just wanted to send out a shout and a thank you to my longtime cemetery friend and tour guide, researcher, and photographer, Don Hall. Don and I have been friends since we first were both tour guides in the early O's, and he also has been conducting courses and doing a lot of research on East Avenue for decades, and was able to touch base with him recently, and he was able to share some photos and stories that I was not aware of. So I wanted that included here today because he's just done a lot for this presentation and also for appreciation of history here in Rochester. Thanks, Don. So as the city grew outward and the wealth increased, we saw all these different business opportunities. Telegraph, wool merchants, engineers, architects, nurserymen, politicians, printers, bankers, buttons, buggy whips, and of course we didn't even talk about cameras because though he was cremated at Mount Hope, George Eastman's remains are not at Mount Hope, and of course he did live on East Avenue. And I think the one thing that I see common amongst all these people is that though they did live in a lot of luxury, a lot of them also were very involved in philanthropy and their communities, churches, and charitable organizations. So for these families, at least, this was truly a gilded age. And now we enjoy East Avenue more as apartments and condos, but at least can still see those beautiful homes that were built by these people. And I'll take any questions. Brandon?
Yes, Sailor, would you mind stopping sharing your screen so we can see anyone who wants to add questions to the discussion?
There we go. Hi, everybody.
We do have time here for a couple of questions if anyone would like to.
Questions or additional stories if anyone has anything they want to share.
Stella, you mentioned about, and what a great talk. You mentioned
Thanks,
about
Doug.
Oliver Culver having 2 streets named after him. I think there's a couple of other candidates. Up by Kodak Park is Bonesteel Street, and a block away is Jessie Street. And Jessie Bonesteel was a famous actress from Rochester, mentor to many well-known actors and actresses named Gregory Peck, Melvin Douglas.
Yep, he was on my Shakespeare tour.
Well, very good. Very good. And she had a stage name, but we have the 2 streets, Jessie and Bonesteel. And also, all my life I'd seen Alexander Street, and then one day I happened to notice a block away is Hamilton Street.
Oh, what do you know? We ought to write a musical.
Well, terrific talk.
Thank you. I saw someone comment, so no, this Otis is not the elevator guy. And as I said, I discovered Otis because basically I was looking to fill in a piece on the East Avenue tour. Like it seemed like I'd be leading people a long time without any stops. And then when I discovered his whole story and again, how revered he was, it's just amazing.
Sally,
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Sally, you had mentioned Mount Hope several times. I got in about 5-10 minutes late.
Sure.
Did you talk about any of the residents of Mount Hope prior to going to East Avenue? Some of them moved from Mount Hope today, but there were a lot of wealthy entrepreneurs, if you will. That's not what they called them back in the day, but they really were.
Titans.
Yeah. Anyway, there, you know, one of the ones is one of my relatives, going way back, actually. He owned from Methodist Hill all the way to the center of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And the Crittenden family had a meat.
Oh, yeah.
They were huge. They were basically the premier family for providing the country with meat. Not just New York, but they provided the whole United States for a couple decades, at least. And then it seems as though the sons of the family didn't have the interest that their father and grandfather had, so it kind of became diminished and was sold off to other concerns. But Armour was one of the ones that profited from that disintegrating Crittenden enterprise.
You know, and that is amazing. A lot of these major food companies, so first of all, it would be impossible to encompass everyone in this prezo. In fact, I got really motivated to do kind of a part two, right? But just like the Curtis brothers, Curtice, the Curtis brothers, which went into Curtis Burns, which eventually was picked up by ConAgra and Birdseye. James Hungerford, you know, many of us go to the Hungerford, well, we used to go to the Hungerford for First Fridays, the building down at Goodman and Main, that they still make Hungerford syrups and like ice cream garnishes and stuff. So you're right, a lot of these things sold to these larger companies that we didn't realize started in Rochester.
Right.
And is your family buried? Your family's buried at the south end, right?
Yeah, right across the street from the distillery.
Yeah. Yep. Good.
Yeah.
Good reference point.
Yeah, and yeah, that might have been a good place if they had been there in their day.
Other questions?
Sally, you mentioned the Hiram Sibley Empire, their huge lot that was bordered by East Avenue, Prince Alexander Street. And the second house you showed, that was actually built by his son, Hiram W. Sibley, and it was designed by James Gould Cutler. This is where they're building the new hotel on the site there. Ironically, in the 1950s, his great nephew tore the vacant building down so he could build what was then called the Treadway Inn. The Sibleys had an additional building on Main Street between Stilson Street and Franklin. People might know the renovation from the 1920s. Scranton's stationery store is in the remodeled version. And the other Sibley major construction on downtown was the Sibley Triangle building designed by J. Foster Warner in the 1890s. You could see that behind the Otis Arch on that photograph you showed at the end. So the Sibleys did a lot of, the last thing I want to mention is the one that was designed in 1925. The original architectural rendering is hanging in that lobby. And that building was designed by a famous Boston architectural firm. And the original design was to have a tall office tower atop that. It was not, what you see today is just the base of the original design. And we're not sure why they didn't execute the complete building, because it was sometime before the 1929 stock crash. So those are some of the tidbits where Sibley's had a lot of real estate all over town as well as out of town.
Well, I thank you for that, because as I was, you know how it is when you're putting a presentation together and you get more and more nervous, you're adding more stuff, you're taking stuff out, and in the middle of this, I'm like, who built that one? Who built that second one? I started getting confused myself because I've been spending too much time with the material. So the second one that was developed by Cutler, that was actually built by Hiram W.
Right, the son, and his wife was from New York City.
Thank you for the clarification.
She didn't like Rochester. We were too small town. She wanted to spend more time in New York City. So while they had that building, that was not their principal residence for much of their lives.
Great. No, thank you, because I was so excited to find a picture of it that and you and I have talked about Cutler before, so thank you.
And just a footnote on the corner of East Avenue and Alexander, Harper Sibley Jr., who was the son of Georgina and Harper, back in around 1960, decided to sell off a corner of their family estate next to the mansion for construction of the Treadway Motor Inn. And that was specifically designed with the guest rooms along the new property boundary, with the parking lot facing Alexander Street, so that from the original mansion, you wouldn't be able to see the cars of the parking lot. And that was the intention at the time. And then when the folks that own the City Grill decided to demolish that, build the new hotel building there, a lot of controversy among the urbanist community.
Yeah,
We really should have
that.
the building right against the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Of course, the story I just related about Harper Sibley was not part of that dialogue, but that relates to why the configuration was as it is. Harper Sibley subsequently got involved in City of Rochester Democratic politics and was named City Police Commissioner back in the 1960s. Then he invested in Sterling Homex, which was a manufacturer of Avon.
The prefab. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes. And the company was going great guns. And then he abruptly sold all of his stock, moved to Florida, and not long after that, the story came out that it wasn't really a good product, and the company tanked, went bankrupt, etc. Yeah. And I remember Fortune magazine wrote quite a story on this entitled "Harper Sibley Knows When to Sell." It was investigated.
Well, and I actually, I live downtown, and I have neighbors that their son-in-law is Harper.
Jonathan Harper Sibley? Oh, no.
I'm not sure.
That's
anyway.
His grandson, yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? I'm just so excited so many people came out today, and I miss seeing you all and having your, the immediate gratification of your responses.
Well,
other questions or nuggets to share? I know we have had a question about will the preso be available to watch later, and I think Brendan can answer that. I don't know if Reverend Swartz is still on.
Yes, I did answer it in the chat, but we will be posting the video. Yep, we'll be posting the video on the RPL YouTube page. Keep your eyes peeled. It might take a couple weeks for it to get up.
Yep.
Do we have any other questions?
Great. Well, we look forward, those of us at the Friends of Mount Hope look forward to seeing you all on our future tours as we're able to get things back. But this is a great partnership with the library, and thanks a lot for the opportunity, Brendan.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks again.